Hello and welcome to Lecture 11 of the Fiat Standard online course. This week's lecture's topic is Fiat States. In this week, we're going to discuss the impact of the fiat monetary system on the global monetary system and how this has affected the international relations between countries and how it has shaped the world's geopolitical order in the 20th century and at the beginning of the 20th century so far. So, as discussed in Chapter 2, the fiat monetary system is similar to the arrangements that the Bank of England had with its colonies before World War I. In other words, all these colonies, if they wanted to trade with the rest of the world, they needed to do so through the Bank of England, and they kept their gold reserves in the Bank of England, and they had pounds in terms of paper that were given to them by the Bank of England, and they had a line of credit from the Bank of England, which they used to trade with other central banks. And a French central banker named Émile Moreau, he mentioned this to describe this arrangement. He said, "The currencies of Europe will be divided into two classes. Those of the first class, the dollar and the pound sterling, based on gold, and those of the second class, based on the pound and dollar, with a part of their gold reserves being held by the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The latter monies will have lost their independence." So effectively, there will be two different kinds of money in the world. The dollar and the pound, which are reserve currencies, and then there will be other currencies which are not reserve currencies, and these other currencies will be backed by the dollars and the pounds. So effectively, the dollar and the pound will be independent currencies, and all the other monies will not be independent currencies. So I think this is an enormously important political and economic development, because once you can get people from another country to take your currency and use it as a monetary reserve for their economy, then you can export your inflation to them. And so this is extremely popular among countries in the fiat century, I think. They all benefit from having foreigners from having foreigners take on their money. And so I think a lot of world politics is just about major countries trying to get other countries to adopt their currencies as reserve currencies. The larger the liquidity pool of a currency, the smaller the domestic impact of any inflationary credit creation by the respective monetary authority. So if your currency is $1 billion and you create another $1 billion to finance government spending, you're going to double the money supply, so prices are going to collapse. If, on the other hand, your money supply is $100 billion, and then you create another $1 billion, you're going to raise prices a little bit. There's going to be a little bit of inflation. There's going to be a little bit of price inflation, I should clarify. And because it's a little bit of monetary inflation, it's only a 1% increase in the money supply. So the more people hold your currency, the more you can get away with inflation, the less the impact on prices when you create more of the money, when you increase the supply of money. So this is why everybody wants to get everybody else to hold their reserve currency. The more fiat central banks are on the fiat network, the more the United States dollars could get away with inflation. The more the US government and the Federal Reserve can get away with the US dollar being inflationary because people keep buying it, because people keep needing it. And so you could think of the enormous support that the US and Britain have done for national liberation movements around the world. You could argue that perhaps some of that was motivated by the fact that these new regimes and new governments that would come into existence would set up central banks that would buy up Bank of England sterling or Federal Reserve dollars, and therefore increase the ability of these central banks to engage in inflation. So it could be argued that there was an element of self-interest in supporting all these kinds of national liberation movements around the world, because these would allow for more, basically, dumping bags on the third world, because they build those central banks and then the central banks need to deal with the Bank of England. So it was extremely profitable to get people on board this central banking fiat network, because it just meant more revenue for the Bank of England or the US Federal Reserve. So as a result of this, we get this monetary system, which Friedrich Hayek in the 1930s called monetary nationalism. And he distinguishes between that and an international monetary system, which is what would be the case where the whole world possessed a homogeneous currency, such as obtains within separate countries, and where its flow between regions was left to be determined by the results of the actions of all individuals. This is really the key idea. An international monetary system is a money whose movement is just a function of what the people who own it choose. In the same way that the US dollar moves freely within the United States of America, and nobody worries about whether there's a trade deficit between New York and California, or if it's a trade surplus, or if there's a trade if there's a capital account surplus or capital account deficit, and too many people are buying stuff from California, or too many people are selling things to Virginia, it doesn't really matter. Nobody really cares, because the money is the same, and it's the same currency. And so if people in Virginia are buying too much stuff from California, that just means that people in Virginia end up with a lot of things, and people in California end up with a lot more money. And that's fine. That's their choices. There is no problem for the governor of California and the governor of Virginia to sit and discuss about this issue. Their citizens decide whatever allocation of money and goods they want amongst themselves, and it's nobody's business. This is what a proper international monetary system would look like. But we don't have that. We don't have a world in which money flows between countries without problem. In fact, if we did have a world like that with a gold standard, in which money was gold and money could flow freely, in that world, we get rid of a lot of the modern problems of money that we have with the fiat system. So, as Hayek continues, it was only with the growth of centralized national banking systems that all the inhabitants of a country came in the sense to be dependent on the same amount of more liquid assets held for them collectively as a national reserve. This is the key idea, that because of this arrangement where everybody had to have their own money and their own currency and their own central bank, and money within one country was different from money from another country, and you couldn't just exchange them for one another seamlessly. It was much more complicated, and there was foreign exchange policy and central banks managing these things. Once that happened, then everybody in the country became invested in that big pile of cash that was sitting in the central bank. Everybody's bank accounts, everybody's life savings, everybody's foreign trades with their business partners abroad, their suppliers and their consumers abroad, all of that then goes into this one big giant jackpot, really, in the central bank, against which the government borrows. So, for a while, the gold standard restrained central banks, which Hayek credits with the development of modern industrialization and modern civilization, and I think that is correct. It was because of the gold standard and the fact that people could save for centuries that all of this development happened. But with time, the gold standard fell apart, leading to inflation and the destruction of functional money. So money has fallen apart since then. And now we end up with this massively problematic system where money is divided between countries, and each country has its own money. And I think, I highly recommend reading Hayek's essay. It's written from the 1930s, and he discusses the problem of having a system where we have different monies in different countries. And I think it was extremely pertinent and extremely prophetic, because it said, the world's going to go to hell if we keep putting up trade barriers, and we're going to start fighting each other, we're going to start becoming militant, and it's going to lead to the growth of the state, and the growth of the power in the hands of the state, and it's going to lead to more totalitarianism and less freedom, and I think he was arguably correct. But in any case, all of that was primarily referring to the countries, the industrialized countries that witnessed the gold standard, whereas the countries that did not have a gold standard never really witnessed industrialization, and because of that, they never adopted a monetary system that was not inflationary. And so what came to be known as the developing world, I think, consists of countries that had not yet adopted modern industrial technologies by the time an inflationary global monetary system began replacing a relatively sound one in 1914. This is it. If in 1914 you hadn't industrialized, then you had a very big uphill battle moving forward, because from 1914 onwards, there was no more hard money in the world. Your people couldn't save, and it was very difficult to trade with the rest of the world because of all of the monetary nationalism and all the barriers to trade. And that restricted people's ability to industrialize and develop. And I think this is really what created this phenomenon of the developing world, these countries that just don't get rich because they've never had hard money. This is what I'm trying to get at. This is the kind of conclusion that I'm trying to arrive at from this chapter. It's the dysfunctional global monetary system continuously compromised these countries' development by enabling local and foreign governments to expropriate the wealth produced by their people. This is, I think, the kind of overarching explanation that I would give for why countries in the 20th century could not get rich. Fiat effectively uninvented money and replaced it with partial barters between national currencies. And it took away people's ability to save. You combine those two things, and you can see why a lot of people had so much problems in the 20th century. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters, and Mexican billionaires Ricardo Salinas Pliego's new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight computer, my favorite computer, because I love to work early in the morning, late at night, outdoors, and in the sun. But regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they can hurt your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen I could use to write, but never found a decent one. Now, a group of Bitcoiners have finally delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I have been using the Daylight computer for more than a year now, and I cannot recommend it enough. And it's led me to invest in the company. Now, they've introduced a new Daylight computer for kids. A calm computer to help your kids focus with no distractions, no mature content, no ads, no tracking, no social media, and no junk content. Daylight is the real low-time preference computer for you and your children. Check out my interview with founder Anjan Katta in episode 249 and go to daylightcomputer.com to see this amazing machine, or kids.daylightcomputer.com to see the kids version, and use code SAFE to get 10% off your purchase. With fiat money constantly debasing, preserving your wealth isn't an option or luxury. It's a financial and moral imperative. If you're familiar with my work, you know the only financial advice I ever give is to buy and hold Bitcoin for the long term. This has never failed anyone. If you want to buy Bitcoin, I strongly recommend using Swan, a group of hardcore Bitcoiners laser focused on making Bitcoin easily accessible. While most scramble to react to each new crisis, Swan private clients are already positioned in the only monetary asset with absolute scarcity, Bitcoin. Swan Private partners with families and institutions who share a principled conviction in Bitcoin as the foundation for multi-generational wealth. With concierge service, deep expertise, and uncompromising security, the Swan team helps clients exit the crumbling fiat system and secure their future in sound money. Today, Swan Private serves more than 5,000 high net worth clients who have purchased more than $4.5 billion of Bitcoin and put it into cold storage. If you're ready to move beyond the false promises of fiat, start your long-term Bitcoin strategy at swan.com/safe, SAIF. We see this problem in the 20th century. We see that as governments took over money, it allowed them to finance all kinds of insane things. As central banks inflated away the value of their currencies, international trade and finance became the release valve through which national inflationary economic distortions would correct themselves. So governments would print money, and then people would try and get around the inflation domestically by getting rid of their money and buying foreign currency. But then that leads to more pressure on the currency. So then the government will place capital restrictions to prevent people from buying foreign currencies, which then makes people want to get rid of their national currency more. And so at the margin, people start selling their currency at an even lower price because they really want to get rid of it, because they'd rather get dollars. And so they start, effectively, all that they do is they just discount their national currency, so they bring the price down. Then another thing that people will do is they'll start wanting to get rid of their money by buying things from abroad. So it's better, if you expect your currency to collapse, so you will start importing things. You'd rather buy a car from abroad now than wait for a year, because in a year you expect your currency is going to lose value. So you want to start importing. So because people expect your government to destroy the value of your currency, they start importing things with their currency, but then that puts more pressure on the currency, because now you're selling your local currency and the central bank needs to send some dollars to the foreign exporter to give you the car or the whatever it is that you're buying from abroad. So what they do then is that they restrict exports and restrict imports and place tariffs on imports to make it more expensive for you to get your car from abroad. And therefore, they'll collect some revenue from the fact that they lost dollars. So effectively, they double the price of the car for you, so that you basically have to pay for the dollars that they need to get in order to sell their currency on the global reserve. So they protect their currency with all of these tariffs, with all of these protectionist measures, which end up being devastating for the local economy, because it makes things much more expensive and it ruins the productivity of producers, of businesses. It's, if you're trying to import machinery from abroad for your factory, it becomes much more expensive because of all of these import duties. So the inflation is itself what leads to the protectionism, which then leads to more economic destruction, which then leads to more inflation in order to fix that, which then leads to more protectionism, and it just gets into this horrible, vicious cycle. So fiat money effectively financed World War I, and then it caused the inflation of the 1920s and the crisis of the 1930s. It exacerbated the crisis by allowing governments to centrally plan their economies, and it required protectionism, which made things much, 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 much worse. And then, because of the protectionism and the depression and all of the extra central planning that the governments were exercising in the 1930s, that led to World War II and the rise of all these totalitarian, powerful states that had enormous amounts of money, which they then spent on doing horrific things. And then after that, it financed the US dollar world order, which was built on a giant global bureaucracy in charge of installing the United States dollar as the king currency of the world, worldwide. So in order to make this dollar work globally, the way that the United States has managed to basically export the fiat software to the rest of the world is through what I like to call the misery industry. The IMF are effectively the lenders of last resort in the global fiat monetary system. The international financial institutions have financing from the United States Federal Reserve and other central banks, and they effectively can absolve anyone of their monetary sins. So the really great thing about these institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, is that they have magic money printed that makes money for nothing. And so whatever your problem is, it can be fixed because they can just print money for you. So the World Bank is another one of these institutions. The World Bank finances development projects with loans, also from the Federal Reserve and other central banks. And generally the way the World Bank works is that they use Keynesian fiction models to basically sell poor countries on expensive investments that they don't need, which are going to be financed by debt. So they'll tell you, come borrow $300 million from us and build a new road network. And then the new road network will lead to increases in productivity, which are going to lead to more tax revenue, which are going to lead to more foreign direct investment. It's going to lead to higher GDP growth, more tax revenue, and so on. So borrow $300 million from us today, and this will more than pay for itself over the next 10, 20 years because it's going to lead to economic growth. This is basically what the World Bank does. It's silly Keynesian central planning nonsense where you just print money and borrow money from the World Bank and spend it on a list of fantasies that you would like to see. Schools, hospitals, roads, airports, infrastructure, seaports, education, whatever it is that you are whatever it is that captures your imagination, and whatever is the buzzword du jour, the thing that people are really fixated on these days, they'll whip up a nice story for you about how borrowing this money is going to have an enormously positive impact. So you borrow the money, and then of course the projects fail. And the projects, of course, are going to fail even if there is no corruption. There's usually a lot of corruption, of course, because it's all fake money that's being handed around, so it doesn't quite attract the most trustworthy characters. But even if there is no corruption, this is central planning, and central planning does not work. So the idea that governments can just take $300 million from the central bank, from the IMF and the World Bank, and go out and make their economies developed is just ridiculous. And only people who benefit from this are the international financial institutions that lend that money to those countries. And so they secure those loans, they benefit enormously from getting those countries into debt. And then the countries, of course, are ruined financially, but then that just means that they are in trouble from borrowing for the World Bank, which means they need help, which is going to come in the form of the IMF. And that's what the IMF does. So you get into debt because the World Bank sells you on all these fictions. And then when you're broke, the IMF comes in and basically starts taking control of your country. And they make you a complete loyal subject of US foreign policy. And they ask you to do whatever it is that they need you to do in order to get bailed out. That's how you get into the fiat system. You get into this cycle of borrowing, and then you just continuously need to borrow more because you can't pay back, because you're spending your money on all these insane projects and all of this Keynesian spending, all this idea that we can fix the economy and make everything better by just having the government spend money. Of course, it doesn't work, but it does work to get you into debt. And then you can be torn to pieces, handed over to creditors. The GATT, what used to be known as the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and what is now called the World Trade Organization, this organization manages global trade, which is essentially a problem that is entirely created by leaving gold. Under the gold standard, there was no need for an international agreement on trade. There was no need for a World Trade Organization. You put things on a boat and you sent them to another country, and when they got to that country, you sold them there, and that was it. Of course, there were some tariffs, but the notion that governments needed to sit and agree trade agreements with one another in order to trade is largely a product of the fiat era, because it is a product of the currency distortions that are caused by fiat. And this is a very important point, because of all of the distortions of currencies, if you study how, current account deficit and capital account, how countries will develop deficits in this because they're manipulating their currency, and then that creates problems for the two countries, and then they need to get together and agree on some way to formulate the trade so that they try and balance the currencies, and it doesn't create a crisis in the currency. All of that comes because of the fiatization of money. And then another wing of this international misery industry that installs the dollar worldwide is academia. Particularly in development economics, is an entire discipline designed to conclude that poor countries need to borrow and listen to international bureaucrats. That's basically the whole point of it. And of course, the big problem here is moral hazard. The biggest problem that all of these organizations face is what is called moral hazard. All of these lenders of last resort and all of these international organizations that have the ability to access Federal Reserve credit is that they encourage the thing that they are meant to prevent. When you say, we've created this organization out there to bail governments out in case they have a shortage of dollars, you're just telling governments, hey, go out there, go crazy, because we're here to bail you out. So the IMF effectively makes bankruptcy manageable and more forgivable, which is very beneficial for the IMF because governments now have a way out of bankruptcy. Governments have a way to escape the horrible consequences of bankruptcy. So that really is the underlying institutional arrangement. It's moral hazard, and it encourages the behavior that it is supposed to eradicate. It tells people that you're going to be rewarded with billions of dollars of money that you can spend to destroy your country even further if you destroy your country. So you get a lot of people destroying their countries, and the IMF benefits enormously from that, and of course so do the financial institutions that are helped by the IMF, and, the banks that lend to those countries as well through the IMF. So the defining feature is also the freedom from accountability. There is no accountability in this entire industry. It's a huge, principal agent problem is what we call it in economics. The beneficiaries cannot hold the providers accountable. The people who provide the services and the projects in these international organizations, they are not accountable to the beneficiaries. They're not accountable to the people who go to the schools and the people who take the roads and the hospitals that these projects build. These institutions are effectively only accountable to themselves. So when you work for the World Bank, you don't have anybody to report to. You don't report to the people in the poor country that you serve. You don't really report to the people in the rich countries that finance you. You report to yourself. The World Bank assesses its own performance and constantly concludes that what they need is more funding. And guess what? They continuously get more funding. The budget for the World Bank just continues to grow, just like the IMF. All these organizations continue to find more and more reasons why they need more funding from your rich country central bank. And they always conclude that they do a great job and that, obviously there are problems and failures, but these can all be fixed by just having more money. And of course, the money comes from the infinite fiat credit printers. So there is no market test. More fiat is always available. There's no problem with financing. The IMF has never had a budget problem to speak of, which is pretty insane when you remember that they are possibly the worst lender in the world. I don't think there is anybody in the world that lends to people that are worse than the clients of the IMF. I mean, everybody the IMF lends to defaults. Any lender who had not necessarily defaults, but they all get all kinds of restructuring and all kinds of problems. Most governments, not all obviously, but most governments in the 20th century have had these problems. So how does the IMF continue to operate and continue to grow when it continuously squanders its capital on financing, Argentinian presidents who do insane things and all kinds of horrific Latin American and African and Asian despots who have built insane palaces and wasted money and robbed money? How does the IMF stay in business? Well, the answer is they're not a business. They are not in the business of making money. So it doesn't matter if Brazil or Argentina or Angola or any country doesn't pay back the IMF or the World Bank, because the IMF gets its money from its financing. It gets its money directly from the fiat credit printers. So when the IMF needs to make a loan to Brazil, Brazil has a financial crisis and they need a quick $20 billion. The IMF doesn't need to go and call Argentina and South Africa and India and say, hey, I need you to give me 20 billion from the money that I lent you. I need it back now because I need to lend it to Brazil. They don't have that problem. If there is the political will to save Brazil, $20 billion can just materialize out of thin air. It's not an issue. They can always do it. So after 7 decades, their budget only ever grows, irrespective of their loans' performance. And the performance of the loans has been abysmal, of course. So this is just a bureaucracy, and it's a bureaucracy that's interested in self-preservation, and it is very good at self-preservation. So remember, we discussed in the chapter on academics and how the academic industry works. We also brought up Mises's calculation critique of socialism and how Mises explains the economic problem of socialism. Because the economic problem of socialism, according to Mises, is the fact that since capital is not owned privately, the people who decide what ends up happening to capital are not able to calculate rationally using market prices the different uses of capital, and therefore are unable to rationally decide where to allocate their capital, because there are no prices. Because if there's no property in capital, there's no market in capital, there's no possibility for knowing who owns what, and therefore nobody is able to calculate properly what happens with the capital. And therefore the capital doesn't get allocated in a productive way, and it ends up getting destroyed. This can be applied in the context of academic studies, as we did in the chapter on fiat science, because in the academic industry, there is no market. And similarly, I think you can apply the same thing to the central planning that is done by these international organizations in developing countries. And of course, the critique also applies in developed countries. But for our purposes, let's focus for a minute on how these organizations conduct their economic central planning. Because they don't have a test of a market, and because they are essentially planning for extremely important things that touch on every aspect of life for people in these developing countries, they rely on aggregates. They construct statistical aggregates, they collect this data, and then they formulate policy based on these aggregates.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
The lives of entire countries are determined based on how the international financial institutions judge their macro aggregates, essentially fictitious constructs. I mean, there is ultimately no such thing as GDP or an inflation rate in the way that it is measured, the CPI. All of these things are fictitious constructs, but they decide everything. They decide everything that happens to these developing countries, because this is how the international financial institutions run their economic calculations. So they put a price on everything, and they have the central planners decide on everything, basically. This is an incredible field of fiat economics called social cost-benefit analysis, where you're probably familiar with cost-benefit analysis. If you're running a business, you think of what are the costs and what are the benefits of running a particular business or a particular strategy, and you calculate these, and then you figure out if that's a good idea to do it or not. Well, if you happen to be the World Bank and the IMF, you're not really running a business to make money. So how do you calculate? You're running a business to improve GDP, or you're running a business to increase literacy, or to increase life expectancy, or to achieve some kind of goal with urbanization or industrialization in this developing country. So if that is how if that is the motivation, then you need to perform a cost-benefit analysis where the costs and the benefits pertain to your goals. But if your goals are things like life expectancy and education and health and income per capita, then you need all kinds of different government-generated statistical aggregates in order to conduct these statistics and studies. And you have to put those things in mathematical formulas, and you have to weigh them against each other. And if this is beginning to sound a little bit creepy, then yeah, you're right. It is very creepy, because basically they are putting the lives of people in those countries as just a numerical value. It's just an amount of money. So the lives and the health and everything that pertains to every individual is just a number in a spreadsheet. They're deciding on these policies that are life and death for people based on how they make these insane, completely fictitious statistical aggregates look. And so if the World Bank comes along and says, we have a central planner that's going to look at this issue, and we're going to decide we need to build a bunch of highways and to make the city more accessible for people in the countryside. They conduct a cost-benefit analysis, and they decide that the costs and the benefits justify this. And then, it turns out that a lot of people are going to need to have their land confiscated from this. Well, that sucks for them, but if we pay them this much money, the benefits for society will outweigh the costs to these individuals. So therefore, the World Bank would recommend something like this, and the World Bank would recommend doing something that involves taking away land from farmers or from indigenous communities, because it makes the GDP number go up, and it increases the metrics that the World Bank is motivated to actually care about. The result is these projects go ahead, and they have a very, very high cost to the lives of the people in those countries. And so it becomes a massive opportunity for outside companies to pillage the country, basically, because they can get anything passed if they just, get these World Bank economists to formulate some ridiculous Keynesian model where, you let us dig for these rare metals outside of your capital city and we'll generate this much money for jobs and this much money for that. All right, it's going to kill a few people, but if you count the cost of a life as, say, $5 million, and then this ends up generating more money than the number of the lives that were killed, then it's totally worth it. So they would be very happy to sacrifice in people there if the total benefits to the government's budget exceed the value that they put on a human life. This is essentially what central planning does. And it's another way in which Austrian economists are different from mainstream and Keynesian inspired economists who have a mathematicization fetish, because they think an economist can calculate the value of everything with spreadsheets, and that's what allows us. That's what is the entire rationale for central planning. That if we can do math better than people can do math in their mind with our spreadsheets, then we should just make decisions for everybody because we know what's better for them. And they miss the point that the entire point is for people to make the decisions for themselves, because people are the only ones who know what matters to them. They may not know math as well as you do, but they know what matters to them. They know their preferences much better than you do, to the point where your extra math skills are completely useless. They would much rather just get a by with their very basic math skills, because at least they're able to know, without doing complicated mathematics, what their preferences are, whereas you can't. So the way this central planning works is that they put a price on everything, and then they allow these international financial institutions have the power then to give infinite credit. So they become essentially omnipotent in society, because they can put a price on everything, and as long as they put it into their equations, then they can justify it, and they can just keep giving the money to the people that want to borrow. So this is a huge security failure in any country, in that with their infinite printer, they essentially take over your local politics, because they have so much money, and they're always ready to lend to anybody who's willing to indebt your children into the future. In fact, what they do is that they make it so that your local politics is going to inevitably be a process for choosing who is the most high time preference in order to be in power. Your local politics are going to center around who's willing to take on the most debt, because the one who's willing to take on the most debt is the one who's going to have more money today in order to buy votes and crush political opponents and establish their control over politics and then the economy and security in the country. So whoever is willing to take more money today at the expense of their children or your children tomorrow and your grandchildren, whoever is willing to put the future into more debt, is able to win today, is able to have more money today. And that's basically what this kind of political arrangement does. You have these central planners, we all know the reasons why central planning always fails, and Austrian economists explain it extremely well. Apply it to these international agencies. They have all of this money, and they're able to centrally plan the entire economy, and they're able to pick winners, and they're able to make anybody the most powerful person in any particular society. So with this, they can get away with anything pretty much. You can accept a project that causes death if the budget return to the government justifies it. And, if you're the person who's assigning the values that go into your spreadsheet, then you can get any result that you want. Of course, the Austrian criticism here is that economics is all subjective. Value is subjective, and only you can determine the value of different options for yourself. And value is something that is ordinal, is not cardinal. We do not attach value numerically to things, and therefore we cannot compare the utility we get from different things in numerical terms. You cannot say that you value your mother a specific number of times the amount that you value your car. These are incomparable. There is no number at which you are willing to exchange your car for a mother. People have an ordinal way of thinking about the valuations of different things. And so when we think, I like this thing more than that thing, and we only ever have to make a choice, should I pay $1 for this thing now, or should I keep the $1 and not have this thing? So we have to make choice in that place at that time about how much we value this thing compared to the alternative. And that's the only thing that we know about it, but we can never know valuation of different things in an accurate numerical way. We are never able to make numerical calculations based on subjective valuation, because subjective valuation is something ordinal. People do not think of economic valuation in terms of numbers. We are not, we don't really think of a constant exchange rate that allows us to compare different economic goods. So only individuals can decide what makes sense for them best. And that's why anything that involves other people deciding for others is just essentially a form of slavery. It's a form of domination. It's only you are able to know what are the things that you value, and only you are able to value them according to how you want them to be. So there can be no rational or moral basis for centrally calculated collective decisions. Welfare is not comparable between individuals, and it cannot be added or subtracted across people. No collectivist central planner calculations have any coherent basis in fact. The economists who engage in them are no more legitimate than actors being paid by the international financial institutions to appear as economists in front of third world governments to entice them to draw on their infinite zero opportunity cost credit line. This is what it comes down to. The reason this is such a popular field of knowledge, this Keynesian macro astrology and modeling and all these calculations, the reason you get these economists who fly from Washington D.C. to countries all over the world and go to these countries and put all of the people in that country in a spreadsheet and attach a value to them and then run the numbers and decide, we've decided, here's what's best for you to do to make your people in your country better off. You don't need that. It's not a valid field of science. It's completely ridiculous pseudoscientific nonsense. And the only reason it is popular is that it is extremely lucrative, because if you get the poor government to say, oh, wow, that's a great idea, it's going to make us better off, then the IMF is able to draw on essentially an infinite credit line. They don't have a budget in restraint. They don't have a problem of saying, oh, how much money do we have to lend? As long as there is the political will to get the country into debt, money will be made. So the IMF is always able to make more cash whenever it needs to lend. It's never had a financial problem. It's never gone insolvent. It has infinite credit facility from the Federal Reserve, which has infinite credit because it is the Federal Reserve. It's the only full node, remember, in the fiat system. So these nodes, the IMF, the World Bank, are constantly promoting these kind of horrific economic pseudoscientific ideas, not because they're great or useful to humanity, or because they help these countries stop being poor, because they're great and useful for the IMF and the World Bank to create more loans and get more countries into debt. So all of these fiat development models conclude that you need debt. And of course, the truth here is that you do need capital, which does require savings. But they'll try and sell you debt as being an equal substitute, a satisfactory substitute for saving, when it is the exact opposite of saving. It's true that you need capital, but if you look at what development economics has done, if you look at the history of thinking in development economics, the history of the study of development economics since World War II, and this is something I've studied with some degree of detail in graduate school, because this was the focus of my PhD, economic development. And also I taught it at the university level in the Lebanese American University. And I'm quite familiar with this literature, so I've studied it over a while. And you see how this literature has evolved from the 40s and 50s. And, there's some detail about this discussed in the book in this section, Development's Ugly History. So, they have the ideas of Harold Domar and Rosenstein Rodin and Walt Rostow and so on. You move from these ideas to more diverse interpretations of what is needed in the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, you move toward the focus of some kind of structural adjustment and fixing the politics of those countries. That it's not just about giving them capital. So initially, I should say, in the 40s and 50s, the idea was big push and linear transformation. What we need is give those countries a big push of money so you can build all the infrastructure at once, and then you jump with that country once, you make a quantum leap from being a poor country that is rural and uneducated and low productivity and has health problems, to a country that is urban, high productivity, industrialized, more educated, longer life expectancy. And the way to do that was with a big push of capital. And where do you get the capital? You borrow. Harold Domar model is all about we need savings, but if you don't have savings, then you have a savings gap. If you don't have enough savings to get the economic growth rate that you want, then you have a saving gap, and the way you make that up is that you go and you get a loan. And so you go from this kind of very basic idea of, what you're missing is capital, and we've got a lot of capital, so get in debt, don't worry about it, you'll be fine, in the 50s and 60s. That was the main way that this worked. But then in the 1970s, you get the inflation problems, and then you get the 1980s, where you have the debt crisis, where all of these countries had gotten into a lot of debt. And now, in the days when there was a lot of inflation, now interest rates have gone up, so the debt is not, they're unable to service their debt. So now you move toward all of these problems of third world debt repayment. And the focus of these international institutions shifts towards, maybe giving all of those countries all of that money was not such a good idea, because maybe they are corrupt and they're not going to handle it very well. So instead, maybe we should give them more money, but this time we tell them to behave well. And with that, they got another 50 years of juice out of this scam. And so since then, they've been, advising countries and structurally helping countries do structural adjustment. And of course, always constantly bailing them out and giving them more money and giving them more debt and getting them into more debt. So we see this constant evolution of ideas, and we change the issues that they discuss. They go from, there was the kind of, overall big picture planning of the early days, and then to a more kind of micro-focused approach, focused on things like poverty and empowerment and literacy and health access and so on. And then you move on to the institutional focus on getting structural adjustment correct and so on. And you're just moving through all of those things. But what is constant through, whatever the problem, whatever the solution, the answer is always that you can do that with debt. So you get into debt, and then, of course, you can't pay back the debt, and that's when things go ugly. And so effectively what the fiat standard has meant on a global level is that when governments go bankrupt, they consume all of their society's wealth. And since all of society's wealth is forced into one monopoly banking and monetary system, it is basically collateral for government borrowing. And so when governments cannot repay, the savings either get devalued or get confiscated. I had a mistake, typo there. The savings get either devalued or confiscated. So this is how it works. They get into debt, and then when the government can't pay, it's the central bank's big stash of cash that is going to bail them out. So remember the role of the international cash reserve, which we discussed in chapter 3. It backs the local currency, it settles international trade, it backs all banking deposits, and it buys government bonds to finance government spending. That same pot of cash. And so when you combine all those four roles in the hands of a government that is also getting into debt to foreigners and now cannot repay the foreigners and is destroying its currency, it doesn't. The end result is that you're devaluing all of this money in order to finance government spending. You're devaluing everybody's savings, and you're putting their ability to trade with the rest of the world at risk to finance the spending of the government. So no matter how many times development plans fail, how much budgetary problems prevail, the IFIs continue to promote the same fiat debt slavery formula for national suicide everywhere. Why? Because they are working as intended. This is a bug, not a feature. This is what it does. This is what these organizations do. I mean, it's insane to expect them to do anything else. This is what they are set up to do. They give out debt and get you hooked on the dollar system. That's what they're there for. So if you understand how these, if you look at these organizations, they've been around now for what, 70 years, is it now? Almost 80 years. Coming on their coming onto their ninth decade, they're in their eighth decade. How can something survive for 8 decades? It must be serving some purpose for it to continue to stay alive. Somebody is feeding this monster if it continues to survive. How is it being fed? Well, it's being fed by people who are obviously satisfied with what they're getting from it. And so what is it that this organization is achieving? And of course, it's not just the people who fund it, it's also the people inside it. This is a bureaucracy and it is focused on self-preservation. And the best way for it to preserve itself is to hand out debt, because the more debt it hands out, the more jobs and money and importance it gets. So the first thing it does is that it provides lucrative careers for insiders in these organizations. So this is just, thousands and thousands of people who get very highly lucrative careers out of this business of getting third world countries into debt. That's working. Tens of thousands of those people have made their careers. Many people have worked there and retired. We've got generations now of these people. The other thing that it does is that it maintains the dollar's role as a global reserve currency. It ensures that all of the world's countries want to borrow in dollars, and since they're borrowing in dollars, they get to keep a big part of their reserves in dollars, and they get to trade with a lot of the world in dollars, and so everybody else needs to get dollars. And of course, it effectively allows the US government a lot of leverage and control over the rest of the world's economies. And all three counts, the international financial institutions have succeeded remarkably. Any goal these organizations might have outside those three, in my opinion, is rhetorical. So they perform these three jobs very well, and that's why they continue to succeed. And that's why it doesn't matter how well they do on all the other stuff that they mention in their brochures and on their website. All these fancy graphic design stuff is marketing, really, but that's not what they do. What they do is what they do very well, and they've succeeded at. So if you look at their impact, they're very fond of doing impact assessments, and the reason they get this is an industry that says a lot of that uses the term impact assessment a lot is because there is no real assessment in the market, so they have to do their own impact assessments, which is a nice gig if you can get it. If you ever find yourself in a job where you get to assess yourself, then I'm going to guess that you're going to come up with a very good assessment every time, and you're going to be doing pretty well. What the impact of this industry, in my opinion, has been is that it's effectively robbed the people of the world to benefit their governments. It forces governments into the fiat system. Well, maybe not. Well, yeah, it does force them. It forces governments into the fiat system, forces them off the gold standard, forces them off hard money discipline, and so therefore makes people in every country very easy prey for their government to spend. And then it robs the people of the world to benefit their government, as well as to benefit the US government, which is issuing the reserve currency that all these other central banks use. So large amounts of public debt, and this is another impact that it has had. It has created an enormous amount of public debt, and it's placed significant amounts of capital in government hands rather than in the hands of entrepreneurs. This is the real impact that it does. When you look at a poor country with a GDP of a few $1 billion, and you'll have a country of an entire GDP of, say, $2 billion, and then you get a World Bank loan for $200 million or for $100 million. Something like 10% or 5% of the society's entire GDP is now in one loan in the hands of the president. I mean, think about just how much command he has over the resources. Rather than people working to serve each other and following the market demand, rather than the money that pays people coming from consumers, now all of the money is coming from the president and from the World Bank and the IMF. And so they're out there hiring everybody, and they're out there able to command all the most significant resources of society. And of course, most important among these is the human resources. And so one huge tragedy of this kind of industry is that in most developing countries, a lot of the smartest people there don't want to become engineers and doctors and entrepreneurs and productive members of society. They want to join these industries. They want to join the misery industry. They want to join these international organizations to get into the debt peddling business and the foreign aid business, and essentially just playing into the fiat circus because it becomes more lucrative than taking on a real risk and being an entrepreneur. So it consumes a lot of the capital of the society by putting it in the hands of the people who receive that money, which I think is enormously devastating. On top of the fact that the debt means you have a massive burden to repay into the future, I think even worse than that is the fact that it means in practice that today, the resources of today end up going into the hands of central planners rather than being in the hands of entrepreneurs. And it causes an enormous waste of human capital, effectively, on writing reports nobody reads to secure donor funding rather than, solving actual problems in the world. So taking a step back and thinking about the actual issue of economic development, what is it that makes poor country become richer? There are really only three drivers of economic growth. At a real kind of fundamental, functional level. Only three things can make anybody get richer, or any society get richer. Capital accumulation, specialization and the division of labor, and innovation, basically technological improvement. So capital accumulation, and I discuss these in depth in my book, Principles of Economics, my next book. Capital accumulation, the more you accumulate capital, the more savings you have, the more productivity you have, and that increases the amount of productivity. That increases the amount of output that you produce. So if you're a fisherman and you're catching fish with your own hand, you're going to have low productivity. If you get a fishing rod, your productivity goes up. If you get a fishing boat, your productivity goes up even more. If you get a giant trawler, your productivity goes up a lot more. So the more capital you have, the higher the productivity. So what makes poor countries and poor people richer is having more capital. So you want to accumulate capital and you want to save to accumulate capital. Secondly, you want to specialize and trade. The division of labor is what creates wealth because it allows people to specialize, it allows people to increase their productivity. And the more you're able to trade with people, the more you specialize, and the more of a choice you have between where you buy your things, the better the value that you're able to get from others, and the more value that you're able to offer others. So the more that we trade with others, the better off we are. This is a very important point, which I also get into in detail in Principles of Economics. And then thirdly, innovation, technological innovation. We find new ways of doing things, and then the new ways of doing things are constantly increasing our productivity. I mean, if it's a thing that increases our productivity, we keep doing it, and so our innovations increase. So these are the three things that can increase the level of development and wealth and productivity in a society. This is how poor countries become rich. This is how poor individuals become richer. And there's no magic formula to it. It's, everybody wants to take the quick magic pill of you just sign up for a World Bank program and in 5 years' time you go from being a poor African country into a country with a very high GDP. It doesn't work that way. It's gonna, it didn't work that way for any country that is currently rich. It didn't happen because they signed up for a 5-year World Bank program. It took decades and centuries of capital accumulation, of trade, specialization and division of labor, and of technological innovation. The advantages that poor countries today have over rich countries is that they don't need to reinvent the wheel and the computer and all of the technologies that we have today. They can just pick up straight up from the tip of the innovation, from the newest thing, which is the highest productivity technology, and start from it. But the notion that we can just copycat everything by just taking capital and borrowing it, that's what's counterproductive. So what's really ended up being the case is that because of the way that the fiat standard functions, and because of the way that these international organizations functions, the actual three drivers of economic growth have been forestalled and destroyed by the fiat standard. And so that's what's really making the plight of poor countries so much worse, is precisely the dysfunctional monetary system that they have been plugged into, and the debt slavery that they have been plugged into. Because remember, everybody wants to get you in debt in the fiat standard, especially the IMF and the World Bank. So when you think about these three drivers and how the fiat standard affects them and how the international financial institutions affect them, you see that basically First of all, they tell you to get into debt. And so that lowers interest rates, that discourages people from saving, encourages people to get into more debt, and encourages people to spend. So initially, the opposite of what you want. So getting into all of this debt is going to destroy your ability to accumulate capital. Secondly, specialization and division of labor. Well, all of these fiat currencies create all of these constant macro imbalances, and that need all of these trade barriers in order to try and make them work. And so you end up also hampering poor countries' ability to trade with the rest of the world, because you're using their current account as essentially collateral for the government to borrow against. And whenever the government is going to default, they're going to be unable to trade with the rest of the world. And whenever the government is afraid of its fiscal situation, it's going to raise tariffs on trade, and it's going to try and restrict trade. So that's going to end up stifling and killing the mechanism of the second mechanism of growth, which is trade and specialization. And then thirdly, innovation. By getting into the system, first of all, you're ruining trade, and so you're preventing people's ability of getting technology, which is the same thing as ruining innovation. You're preventing people from getting access to the cheapest innovations in the world because you're preventing people from trading freely. But then also, joining the international financial institutions also includes the World Trade Organization, which prevents countries from getting modern technology because of all of these insane intellectual property laws that serve no purpose but to slow down the spread of knowledge in the world in order to benefit a few rent seekers and large corporations, essentially, that are big patent trolls that get patents and sick lawyers on people to get their money from people that are actually building things. So these international financial institutions, part of the deal of getting you into debt is also that you need to sign on to all of these intellectual property agreements, which prevent you from benefiting from all the technological innovations of the world, and it is just, I think, massively destructive. So in reality, it sounds all nice and dandy when you look at their posters and their brochures. The IFIs, the international financial institutions, are doing so much to get the world out of poverty, but really, they are the biggest obstacle, arguably, in many cases. I mean, obviously not the only obstacle. In many cases, the local governments are a bigger obstacle, but they are a big obstacle in the face of anybody trying to get out of poverty in the developing world, because there is no getting out of poverty without a market system, without economic production, without division of labor, without capital accumulation, without technological innovation. And these things can't be done without money. We need money in order for an economy to function. And without a functioning monetary system, you can't do any of those things. So, without sound money, saving and capital accumulation are disrupted. Global trade is disrupted. Innovation is disrupted. Everything is dysfunctional, essentially, without sound money. And developing countries really do not need debt to grow. What they need to grow is they need to be free, and they need to have sound money. It's not a miracle. It's not some insane quest to figure out how poor people become rich or how poor countries become rich. They just accumulate capital, increase productivity, trade with the rest of the world. But to do that, you need sound money. And what these financial institutions do, what the IMF and the World Bank do, is they destroy the ability of these countries to have sound money, and then essentially get them hooked in this debt cycle that continuously exacerbates the problem of poverty and prevents them from escaping it. That is it for this lecture. Thanks.